Hey, everybody. The podcast this week, we're going to talk about the Texas Revolution. And it's a mix of some podcasts I recorded a few years ago and some podcasts I'm recording this weekend. So, in this first podcast, in this introductory podcast, I want to give you a big picture of what's going on and what led Texas to break from Mexico. I just want to remind you that in 1836, there were probably in the range of 36 to 38,000 Texans in the Department of Texas. Uh, 30,000 were Anglo-American, 5,000 were African American, and about 4,000 or so were Tejanos. So it's pretty amazing if you think about it that by 1836 there were actually more slaves in Texas than there were Tejanos. And of course, this was Tejano territory. The Tejanos had been here since 1718. And I know, wait for it, you're dreading it, I'm going to do it anyway. This is a legacy of Spain's failure to populate this region. So Mexico City, really beginning in, and I've talked about this in previous podcasts, the central government in Mexico City is starting to really freak out because demographically, Texas is far more Anglo-American and with their slaves than it is Tejano. And of course, on top of that, Texas borders Louisiana. Texas borders this very, very dynamic area of the United States in which cotton production has really taken off. Now, there's cotton production all through the South, but especially in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, this is really the heart of cotton production for the southern US. And this is the region that Texas borders. By the way, we don't know, but I'll throw it out there. You won't be tested on this. There were probably around 15,000-ish Indians in Texas in 1836, but no one was counting Indians at that time. So what had happened, big picture now, is that slavery completely transformed the Texas borderlands in northeastern Mexico, of course, because Texas is still part of northeastern Mexico, in such a way that it brought the colonies, the Texas colony, into conflict with the Mexican national government beginning in the late 1820s and going all the way up to the Texas Revolution of 1836. What was happening is that Mexico City was growing very alarmed, beginning with the Tehran expedition in 1827, I believe it was, or maybe a little bit later, 1828. Anyway, this is why I don't test you on dates. I can't remember myself. But beginning when Tehran comes up here and he looks around, he goes, oh my God, Texas is more American than it is Mexican. And what happens is then Mexico City attempts to reassert its control over Anglo-Texas, which is going to cause tension with the Texans, especially Anglo-Texans, but also Tejano Texans, who have been pretty used to doing their own thing, or at the very most, just answering to the state government in Saltillo. Beginning in the late 1820s and into the early 1830s, the Mexican central government in Mexico City is going, hold on. Okay, we have a big problem here. So what happens is the central government in Mexico City, which hadn't done much in the early 1820s vis-a-vis Texas, it had pretty much let Saltillo run the show. It tries to reassert its authority in Texas, which only causes problems and tensions and leads to the Texas Revolution. Now, this interference, if you want to call it that, it manifests itself in 1829 when Vicente Guerrero, who for a brief time is the president of Mexico, he issues a decree freeing the slaves in all of Mexico. Now, what happens is the Tejanos in Texas manage to kind of mitigate that decree by Guerrero. They hide it, they put it under the table, they persuade the Mexican government not to really enforce it. But that's a good example of how the Mexican central government is starting to tighten its grip on Texas And also, it's bringing to the table this anti-slavery feeling in the Mexican nation itself. And I think I just have to say it once again. Let's give Mexico some credit for being anti-slavery and opposing the institution of slavery. And another thing, interestingly, when Guerrero emancipates or frees slaves in 1829, not a single Mexican dies because of this order. When during the Civil War, over 700,000 Americans died. A war that led to the emancipation of U.S. slaves. So the emancipation of U.S. slaves cost 700,000 lives compared to zero in Mexico, which is a pretty incredible figure if you think about it. So another example of the interference from the central government, the law of April 6, 1830, which I've talked about and you'll be quizzed on, basically shutting down after a brief window of time, shutting down immigration from the U.S. Of Anglos. So Mexico's trying to close the barn door, but it's really too late. As I've talked about a lot, the policing ability of the Mexican government was very weak. They could issue decrees and they could declare laws, but that doesn't mean they could really enforce them. So folks like William Barrett Travis, who comes in to Texas and stays in Anahuac, and Anahuac was the community in the Austin colony that the cotton was shipped to, and from there, from Anahuac, it went to New Orleans. Travis comes into Anahuac as an illegal alien, but there's really no one there to stop him. And you have this new generation of Anglo-Texans coming into the state around this time that have no interest in having Texas work within the Mexican nation. I just want to stress to you again, Austin really did initially want Texas to work within the Mexican nation. Even as late as 1835, he wants Texas to be in Mexico, but as a standalone state. Austin also wants Texas to be the one slave state in Mexico. So what you have is a more militant group of Americans are coming into Texas at the same time that the Mexican government is trying to crack down on Anglos in Texas because the numbers are just so shocking. Can you imagine being a government official in Mexico City and you read that, by the mid 1830s, that there's only about 35 to 4,000 Tejanos in a state, or at least the part of a state that's 36,000, that Tejanos are completely outnumbered. And the further east and north you went into Texas, the more Texas was American than it was really Mexican. San Antonio was still very Mexican. La Bahia, Goliad was still very Mexican. But you go further east, for instance, into the Austin colony, that's almost completely American. These folks had promised to learn the Spanish language. They promised to convert to Roman Catholicism. Very, very few of them did that. Most of them remained Protestant. Very few of them learned Spanish. So you can see why the Mexican government is starting to freak out. And so what's behind this is this whole cotton economy, which is what's bringing U.S. whites with their captive slaves into Texas. And so what happens is that Mexico City tries to crack down on Texas, the centralist, right? Remember the centralist. It's very easy to remember because centralists, they want the power in the central government, right? That's what makes them centralist. So Mexico City starts to crack down. The centralists gain the upper hand. And the colonists, the Anglo colonists in Texas, and I say Anglo colonists because the slaves sadly had no political voice, and the Tejanos, they become more ardently Federalist just at the same time. So what happens is the tension in Texas, the way it manifests itself in the terms of Mexican politics, is you have centralists in Mexico City trying to crack down on their northeastern frontier, which is Texas, And you have federalists that are saying, wait a minute. The Constitution of 1824 says that all the power is supposed to be in the state. And now Mexico City is trying to reassert its control over us. And that's not fair. That's unconstitutional. You're breaking the rules that you wrote. So then what happens is there's basically a standoff between the Texans and the Mexican government over over slavery and over cotton in the development of Texas. But ultimately, what the Texas Revolution is about, certainly slavery is an underlying cause. There's no doubt about that. But what the fight is about, it's about federalism versus centralism. And federalism would provide more protections for slavery than centralism. Remember, federalism is local control, and centralism is control from Mexico City. And Mexico City had no interest or no sympathy at all for Texas being a slave state within Mexico. The anti-feeling, the abolitionist feeling in Mexico City was very, very strong. And so what happens is when the government in Mexico City reasserts its control, you have basically an anti-slavery central government that is trying to reassert its control over a territory in which slavery has become a very, very important component of the economy of that territory. So these are the issues that are coming together by the Texas Revolution. Now, let me just remind you of one thing before I finish this particular podcast, that when the revolution catches fire, as Jorge says, in the fall of 1835, things go very well for the Texans at the beginning. They capture Gonzales, the famous Come and Take It battle. The Mexicans had lent a cannon to the Anglo settlers, Gonzales. When the Mexican commander of San Antonio, the commander of the Mexican army in San Antonio, tried to get it back, the people of Gonzales refused to give it back, and there was this minor skirmish, and someone sewed a flag that said, "Come and take it." Interestingly, and actually, in my view, very sadly, the whole "come and take it" incident has become kidnapped by pro-gun rights advocates, and it's become a symbol for guns rights in a way that I think really distorts historical memory. But that's the history of that incident. Then what happens is the Texas rebels in the fall of 1835, they capture Goliad, which is very significant. It's a significant location in Texas. Then, most importantly, they capture San Antonio. Okay, so one of the things I want to get across, and I haven't talked about it yet, is at the beginning, things go very well for the Texans. But after the capture of San Antonio in 1835, as you'll see, I'll develop this idea in my podcast, things go very, very poorly for the Texans, up to and including the Alamo.